Hanson.
Here.
Tylen.
Here.
Monday.
Present.
Tome.
Here.
Zapataki.
Here.
Parpart and Robbins are excused.
All right, we have a quorum. Thanks, Matt. This meeting has been noticed in accordance with state statutes and local ordinances. Next item then is to approve the agenda. Unless there's any discussion on that, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda as it's presented.
So moved. Second.
Motion and second to approve the agenda as presented. Any discussion on the motion? If none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Agenda is approved. Then approval of the minutes for our last meeting, which was December 20th, 2018. There should be a copy on the back side of your agenda page. If there's any alterations or changes or suggestions, please let me know, or I'll take a motion to approve the minutes from December 20th when you're ready.
Motion to approve the minutes of December 20th.
Second. Motion a second to approve the minutes from the December 20th, 2018 meeting. Any discussion on that? If none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Citizen comments. I see no one present this evening for citizen comments, so no unfinished business. And then on to new business. Item A is review and discuss proposed amendment to the zoning code. This was brought forward to the city council at Tuesday's meeting. I'll let Matt kind of outline it.
So what I put in your packets was basically the exact same, well, it is the exact same thing I presented to council on Tuesday night. Just to give you a little background, last week, Patrick Vandersanden, our city administrator, myself, met with the folks from general engineering, Dion, who's our new building inspector, and Michael, who's his supervisor. And as a result of that meeting, we decided to kind of enhance the communication between the building inspector and the city. We thought it would be best to implement a zoning permit. And really, it's also going to give the city, the purpose for the city, it'll just give us a way to check to make sure that everything that goes in will actually be up to code, and not relying on our building inspector to do it. The way it stands right now, our building inspector is actually, by our code, identified as our zoning administrator. So this change will take some burden off of the building inspector and put it more on, assuming I get appointed by the council, which I figure I will be, it'll be put more on my position. So that's really kind of the background on it. One of the things I will note, as far as ordinance changes go, if you look at 11449 of our zoning code right now, it says that we should be issuing a certificate of zoning compliance, but in actuality, we have not done this in the past. There's really two things that we need to do. We need to discuss whether or not there's a fee that would go for that application, and then also create an application itself. So there's some sort of process where people can come in and apply. Tonight, this is just kind of a baseline discussion, update type of situation. I didn't hear any objection from council on Tuesday. And what we're planning to do is next month at our plan commission meeting, there will be a public hearing because we are going to be making amendments to our zoning code. So anytime we make an amendment to our zoning code, plan commission reviews it, makes a recommendation to council. So, and we didn't do it this month because the time you have to have it noticed so many days in advance before the meeting. So this will give us the chance to do a class 2 notice, put it in the paper, which means you put it in the paper twice, and then we'll hold our public hearing next week and then next month and make a recommendation to council. You can see I've talked with our city attorney. He's included the draft language basically to start this process for an ordinance. One thing that we would be doing would be making the zoning administrator a appointment by council, and then kind of outline some of the powers of the zoning administrator and changing some of that language under 11447. So really, we got to pass an ordinance changing the zoning administrator, create that zoning permit application, and then talk about a fee structure. But the fee structure would be done at the council level. What would trigger the need for a permit? I've already done some research on to kind of how other communities do it and what fees they charge. Most notably, I talked with Sun Prairie because A friend of mine happens to be a planner for the city of Sunbury, so I talked with them, and their fee is only $25, and a lot of the reviews are going to be quite simple. It's going to be, here's a site plan for a house. Does it meet the setback requirements? Yes or no? It's going to take me, assuming the site plan is drawn correctly, it's not going to take me much time at all to review it. So that's why the fee would be lower. But what would trigger it would be new construction, building additions, any sort of site alterations where you increase impervious surface. So most notably, if you're expanding your parking lot, a change, you have a new use, a change of use, or a reactivation of use. So if you have a vacant storefront and somebody leases it and it's the same use, I would still have to, check off and make sure it's a permitted use and go through that process. So that's what we have entailed right now. Obviously, if it's like a remodel or anything that's just building wise, that doesn't really change the site as a whole. That would just be your standard building permit process, and I would not need to review things like that. So any questions on what this is and why we're doing it?
How many other communities in the area or the state do you have an idea that are following the same procedures of what you're talking about?
I would only be guessing. I've looked at kind of our neighbors. Sunbury has it. I didn't really see anything clearly outlined from Beaver Dam or Portage, or Wall Pond for that matter. And I didn't look closely at their ordinances to see what they have in their ordinance. Okay. But, as I saw, Sunbury had it, and as I knew somebody who worked for the city of Sunbury, so I called him and just asked. I know other communities that do this. Each kind of community calls it different things. And some of them, they have it more broken down into different buckets. So like, if you're doing if you're a permitted use and you're doing an expansion or new construction, it's going to be a site plan review. A lot of other communities have occupancy permits, so they give you zoning occupancy if you're, I have a retail strip center and, I want to have a tenant come in. It's just the way for the city to verify that the tenant's use is in accordance with our zoning code. So
I'm in favor of it. I just
there's not one uniform. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's not one uniform way communities do this. Okay. I like this because I think it's simple and it's already on our books, and it would only take a little bit of tweaking to basically update that 11449 of our code. The other thing I should note that is important is that part of the zoning administrator responsibilities is our floodplain zoning, which is under chapter 26 or 46 of our code. So I will be getting more involved with that. So I think that's a good thing, especially with some of the discussions we've had with recent developments over the last couple of years. So especially since the floodplain map changed in 2016, there's been a few issues. So any questions?
So you mentioned like remodels wouldn't necessarily have to go through this process. Was that correct?
Yes, if you're remodeling your house.
Okay. But would that require a checkoff by the zoning administrator?
No, at that point that would just be a building permit.
Because that could potentially change the use in particular with regard to floodplain ordinance, adding value into a home or building that is in the floodplain. I guess what I'm saying is I might suggest that still has to cross the zoning administrator's desk. It might be as simple as a checkoff, but at least the zoning administrator is looking at it.
Good point. I will talk with Dion, because one of the issues that we had, we talked about adding to the building permit form that a little check yes or no, where the owner has to go certify whether or not their property is in the floodplain. Most people don't, but at least this way it makes the property owner think about whether or not they're in the floodplain. I was going to have that on the zoning permit form, so it kind of was our way of working it around. But I think getting back with general engineering and say, no, we probably should revise the building permit form to include that information. So the owners certifying themselves whether or not it's in the floodplain, or at least reviewing it. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, Matthew, I just wanted to dig just a little bit deeper into the what's driving this. Are there actual instances of zoning issues, or is it just kind of cleaning up kind of what we've been doing? It's already on the books and making it make sense that way. So
It's more or less cleaning up what we're already doing. Well, since I've started here a year ago, I do have frequent interaction with our building inspector. It was previously Jake, and then it's Dion. But they don't have the background that I do, so I'm probably better suited to do it. And then for the other thing is general engineering said in the meeting that they want this because they don't want the responsibility of the one that has to be verifying the zoning. And that's really what it says now, is that it's general engineering that does it. And since we don't issue a certificate of zoning compliance, essentially when we issue a building permit, that is their way, or our way right now of saying the zoning's okay on this. And in some cases, the zoning might not be okay on it, but the building permit gets issued because the building inspector is looking at the building code, and they're not looking at the zoning code. And they do a good job at what they do, but, both need to, when something gets built, it has to comply with both codes, so.
but this would be another, if I'm just even doing, it would be another application. It's another fee in addition to the building code application or building permit.
No, I understand, and it's the balance between being too burdensome to people who are actually completing development in our community, but at some point there's got to be a check that what they're doing is up to code, and I guess that's why we're doing this, and that's why a smaller fee, especially for a lot of the simpler stuff, I think is appropriate. I do know when we get into like site plan reviews and let's say it's the bigger thing is if it's something for a new construction that's larger than an acre, but it's a permitted use. Well, if it's larger than an acre, they have to go through a different permitting process. And usually Jason becomes involved because then stormwater type considerations come into play. And the thing that happens right now in a lot of cases is that the city really doesn't have a mechanism to recuperate fee or the amount of money we have to pay Jason to actually review it. In other cases, if it's a rezoning or if it's a conditional use or if it's a subdivision, they have to pay a deposit, and the deposit will go to pay Jason's time when he's reviewing this for the city. So having kind of two tiers has crossed my mind as well in the fee structure, because if it is something a little bit bigger and a little bit more complex and it is a permitted use, I don't think it's unreasonable that the city has fees to cover my time, Jason's time, Paul Johnson's time, whoever's reviewing this. And I try to use our development team as much as possible because that's kind of already covered in Jason and Paul's time. So I try not to be too burdensome to those who are trying to, build things in our community. But in the same token, the reviews need to take place and somebody's got to pay for it.
So the tiering, is that something that is kind of just concept, or is that something?
It's conceptual. I mean, nothing's been approved yet.
Yeah.
And nothing's been written on paper. I mean, right now, we're talking at the bare minimum is just making sure that the zoning administrator is appointed by the city, so they can appoint whoever they want. Technically, they could just make that change and appoint me as the zoning administrator, and then we wouldn't, I mean, theoretically, I would just have to review everything that that the building permit or building inspector receives just for zoning compliance and not have a fee. I mean, theoretically, we could do that. I mean, there's probably a couple other options, but this is kind of the option, after talking with Patrick and other staff, that we thought this was the best way to attack it, so.
Okay, thanks.
So the code that you have, or this is the exact language you have that would be coming forward at this point to the public hearing next month?
Assuming Paul doesn't change anything between now and then. Yeah, that's what Paul gave me.
And is that going to give you some flexibility as far as what you're talking about here? I mean, the comment that Uriah made, you mentioned something very early on about feast or like vacant reactivation of a storefront. Like if there's a zoning concern that comes up, yeah, I think those are things that we're kind of talking about in the city right now too. But does there need to be any other amendments within the zoning code?
If it did, it would be under 1449, which outlines what triggers the need for a certificate of zoning compliance. You want me to look that up on my phone?
No.
I could, okay. Or is it-
I just don't know. My question is if we're going through the process of having a public hearing, is this the only thing we need to accomplish? And then if we need to amend any other zoning codes beyond that, are we okay? Or do we have to go through that process again?
Yep. No, I'll check with Paul.
Okay. I don't really enjoy going through the minutia of zoning code. I don't have a large understanding of the zoning stuff. I can read ordinance, but I just want to make sure if we're updating it that we make sure that we.
And when this was first proposed to him, probably a day or two later, he gave me a 50-page document of all places where basically, I assume he went through and did a search where it said zoning administrator and then started cleaning up language where it needed to be cleaned up. And I guess I'll follow up with him on that if that's going to be part of this ordinance. In my brief discussion with him, I do recall him saying that this is essentially right now to fix the zoning administrator issue and get that done with as soon as possible.
Okay.
Because the others might take longer.
Okay.
This was the low hanging fruit, so to speak.
Sure.
So, but
I know we have money budgeted this year. That was one of our wishes, is to try to clean up code in general.
One of his wishes.
If we can get more accomplished at the same time, I'm
Yeah.
a fan of that. But
Yeah.
if this is just the first step and we need to do it in several different passes, I guess, so be it. But I think it will help eliminate some confusion. You're right.
Kind of to that point, and for clarification, so this ordinance establishes the zoning administrator as an appointed particular person, right? The application form and the fee structure, if I'm not mistaken, those are already, there's language already written in the zoning ordinance saying something like, an application form shall be filled out by the applicant and it might be updated from time to time. Same thing with the fee structure. So in other words, the fee structure and the application isn't sort of attached as part of this ordinance, right? I want to say that the zoning ordinance gives latitude to staff to put those things in place as they see fit. Even if I'm mistaken about that, it's not the intent to adopt those things along with this, right?
No. I mean, the fee structure, technically, well, that's something that needs to be cleaned up in our code as well. If you look under 78, which is our planning section of our code, it's 78. I want to say 53, but don't quote me on that. But there is our fee structure. However, 5 years ago, 10 or 6 years ago, somewhere in the recent past, the cities kind of started to update a fee schedule that is essentially has replaced that, but they never passed it via ordinance. So now there's confusion because there's essentially yeah, you're nodding your head in agreement. So yeah, so I'm explaining this clear. Yeah, there's essentially two different. People could view it as there's two different fee schedules. So at some point, I think, and the city needs to determine whether or not they just remove. I think it'd probably be easiest to remove the fee schedule from our municipal ordinance and just say the fee schedule is posted, as adopted by council or whatever the language would be. I'm not a lawyer, so because that would be simpler. Because right now there is some confusion over what is our fee schedule.
Right. But for the purposes of this, it's that those documents, talking about getting into the minutia of things, those documents are not part of this particular ordinance.
Correct. But
change.
the reason why I say
the
reason why I say we need a fee schedule is if we elect to have a fee schedule for this permit, we don't have one established anywhere. So that kind of opens that can of worms of looking at the fee schedule. And as I said, the application form is something pretty simple. And, I guess there's some, why I'm talking the application forms. I would assume that we'd want Plan Commission to be the one to review all of our application forms and approve it. I don't know if that's ever been done. I mean, I have no idea how old they are. I look at them and for the most part, they look like what they reference is correct, but I haven't had the time to actually go through and update them and make them look nicer. But I don't know. Is that something that would interest this group if I actually brought it to this group to say, here's our application forms every now and then, maybe annually? Yeah.
Sounds like a hoot.
Well, I know it's boring, but
Well,
wait till we get into the other agenda item tonight. That will be.
Taking a look at those every once in a while, I think, is worth it, especially if they haven't been looked at in a while.
Well, and I would feel better having a public body look at it rather than me sitting in my corner office and doing it by myself. I think there should be some sort of, city approval of them. So.
Sure.
Is there any other questions about this?
My understanding is you're just showing us what's going to happen.
Correct.
There's no action required tonight. It'll
Correct.
be coming back. To the
I
next
will
planning
note that
commission.
I have talked with other city staff about this, and most notably Randy Keene was pretty excited because I know a lot of times occupants will go into buildings and he will not have any sort of notification. When I say occupants, I'm talking more commercial side of things, where it triggers the need for a fire inspection. So that will, hopefully enhance that conversation, or up front, we'll have that communication. So the fire inspection will hopefully happen before somebody goes into business instead of after the fact. I think would be helpful. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, if there's nothing else from the Planning Commission, we can move on to item B then, which is review and discuss the initial draft of Chapter 2 of the Columbus Comprehensive Plan that Meg's been working on.
So, sorry for normally I like to get the packets out about a week in advance, but I've been behind, and this chapter is, when I've done comprehensive plans in the past, this is probably my least favorite chapter to write, because it's just, you're looking at a lot of sources, and it's a lot of regurgitation of DNR lingo, and that's just not my area of expertise. So I'll do my best to kind of like walk you through, and I'm not going to read it word for word because I don't want to put you guys to sleep. But I'm just going to hit on the high points. If you have any questions, or if you see any typos, let me know. As I said, along like the first chapter that we reviewed, this is the first initial draft. When I start getting final drafts together, they will come to this group for their preliminary approval, and then we'll go from there. But start at the page 1. It's just an introduction, talking a little bit about the state statutes and things that we have to look at in this chapter. One of the things I always like to kick off each chapter with is kind of looking at previous planning efforts that would have impacted the community. So, looking at county level plans, and then I've also looked at a few other planning efforts that I found of note. I thought the second Ward Creek stormwater flooding and alternative analysis and Fireman's Park, that was provided to me from Rupert Milkie. They've done a couple studies in the recent past to deal with flooding. The second Ward Creek alternative analysis was completed in 2010. That one it was kind of on the heels of the city had a really bad flood in 2008 and some other flooding in the late 2000s. And then on the heels of that, this study was done. One of the things that came out of that, they had a few recommendations. And one of the things they've actually implemented was that they removed sediment at structures throughout the city that help basically with the flow of water. And they also did some other dredging in other areas. And I talked with Jason Letha about it, and he kind of said that a lot of the recommendations that came out of here was some of the low-hanging fruit. The thing is that I think these activities are probably something that are ongoing and probably could be done every 5 to 10 years. I guess I would rely on the engineers for their expertise on it, but I thought this should be documented in this plan so we could, the city can check in and say, hey, this year we probably should put some money in the budget to go do some dredging to make sure that, if we did have a flood event that, Second Ward Creek, hopefully we can mitigate the impacts that would have. The other thing is talking about the Fireman's Park stormwater analysis. Really the big thing there, if you look at the report, is that there's a couple culverts that are long culverts that are going through Fireman's Park that you would really increase the, I know you're the flood expert, so I probably should just shut my mouth, but it's the cubic feet per second will be like 4 times higher. So the rate of water movement through the park would really be better. It wouldn't back up as much and probably into the golf course and probably into the Parkview Estates subdivision. So some interesting capital improvement projects that the city could possibly undertake to remove some culverts, open some water up through Fireman's Park, and it could have a positive impact on our flooding. One of the things I've already looked into for this is there is a few programs through the state where potentially we could get a grant to help mitigate some of the flooding that's caused by this infrastructure. So, I've read through a few of these plans, or at least glanced through them, just to kind of get a good understanding of what has been done in the past. Moving on to page 2. If there's any questions at any point, please interrupt. It's not. Page 2, agricultural resources. This is still a section that's in that I need to beef up. No pun intended. But when you look at agricultural trends, that section was from the UW extension from Columbia County. They put this together, and it was a really good summary of things that are going on in our area. The one thing I would like to note is that the agriculture is a $672 million business in Columbia County, and I know there isn't necessarily and I don't know how to word this, and it does have a large impact on Columbus too. When you look at some of our employers in and around town, and agriculture is a big business. And one of the things that came out of the Land and Water Resource Management Plan that I'll talk about later is looking at what the county has for recommended policies as far as urban transition areas and how we can best work to mitigate the potential impacts that you can have on agricultural, especially prime agricultural lands. So if you turn on to page 3, you can see there's still a little bit of data that I need to pull together as far as the data in the past for these tables have been at the county level, so they don't necessarily say much about Columbus, but it is kind of nice to have that high level county view of what's going on with our farms throughout the county. Moving on to land resources, talking a little bit about geography and topography, talking about different types of the landscape, especially talking about how the last ice age really impacted the landscape here in our area. Talking a little bit about soils. As I said, a lot of this information is pulled from either DNR or the county UW Extension Agency. Moving on to page 4, I do talk about the benefits of having forests and woodlands, but one thing I wanted to note is that we are a Tree City USA, and we've been a Tree City USA since 2005, and I put a little information on what that actually means. Another thing that we have to identify is all our metallic and non-metallic mineral resources, so I kind of talk about those briefly. And I do note that we have in the city limits, we have one quarry. That's Michael's out on Highway 60. We do have another one that is just adjacent to our city, but I did not include that into this. Moving on to water resources, I talk about groundwater is the first subject, and obviously groundwater is the city's source for drinking water. One of the things that I thought was interesting is that, and I'll touch on this later too, but you talk about the two different types of pollution, and then you talk about non-point source, so it's like there's not one direct attribute, or there's not one direct entity that you can attribute to. It's a group of, in most cases in Wisconsin, it ends up being a group of farms, agricultural runoff that ends up impacting the water. But that, or point source, which is essentially kind of what it's a direct polluter. So, what you kind of always think of when you think of that, it's your big industry in town having a pipe that it just, goes right into the water source. So talk about that. One of the things that I thought about when I was going through the section is that, the city's already been fairly proactive with the whole, by recently doing the NASCO deal and using those funds to help educate farmers in the area for field runoff and how to better control that. So I thought that was something that, as this gets further developed, I'll put in there as a good policy that the city should keep doing and explore further. At the top of page 6, I talk about surface water. So the city's in two watersheds. It's the upper crawfish and the lower crawfish. Generally, the Lewis Street, Charles Street, Western Avenue, as it runs diagonal through our community. So if you go out on James here, kind of once you get up to the top of the hill, that's essentially the dividing line for the two watersheds. Both of these watersheds do end up in the Mississippi River by going through the Rock River. And in addition to the crawfish, there's a couple other waterways that really impact our city, notably Robbins Creek and the Second Ward Creek. And really, the Second Ward Creek probably has got the largest out of those two. You got a question? You just. Oh. And then the second paragraph there is just talking about navigable waterways and some information that essentially is from DNR. Other things that are identified by DNR is the outstanding and exceptional waterways. And I go through and kind of give a description of what that is. However, there are no outstanding or exceptional waterways within the city. However, the city, the mill pond behind the dam has been designated as a priority navigable waterway because it's a lake that's smaller than 50 acres. And I'm doing a little more research onto that because there's really not much detail on the DNR website on what a priority navigable waterway is. I just saw that designation was out there, and I'm like, well, we probably should include that in the comp plan because the comp plan just ends up being, a compilation of everything that impacts our city. So, large record. Do you? No. Okay. Yeah. So my assumption is correct that there's not much detail out there because I couldn't find much. I was on their website, doing a lot of research, and I just couldn't see anything that really clearly defined what it was. Okay. The next section is talking about impaired waterways. This is under the Clean Water Act. These are the 303, known as the 303D list. Essentially, it's looking for the total maximum daily loads and looking for certain kinds of pollutants in the water. We actually have two, and they break it. The mill pond is actually has been identified by DNR fish consumption advisory due to high levels of PCBs. And then if you go basically north of the mill pond to the headwaters of the Crawfish River, that whole stretch of water is identified as impaired due to higher than permitted phosphorus levels in the water. And that goes back to us working with, or us trading our credits with NASCO and then selling, and then taking the money and reinvesting that. I think one of the things that I'll be putting as a goal, objective, and policy, and or however it's going to be worded in there, is that we'll continue to do that to help get that stretch removed, and hopefully it won't be an impaired waterway moving into the future. So the next section is about floodplain, and as everybody knows, it's the most common natural disaster in Columbus. It technically it probably floods every year because the river usually gets out of its banks. Most years, thankfully, there isn't as much damage as other years, but it's still something that we need to obviously pay attention to. The one thing I will note is that I love the diagram on the right, and it's from DNR, but I think it does a good diagram of explaining the difference between a floodway and a flood fringe, and showing, if you're going to develop if you look on the left of the diagram, if you're going to build a home or any other structure in the flood fringe, you can, but you have to bring a fill in. It doesn't say that you have to go through a whole process, but it's just a good visual. At least I think it's a good visual to help understand better the parts that make up a floodplain. So other than that, I don't have too much specifically to talk about in the floodplain, so I'll move to wetlands. One of the things that I just want to touch on is the bullet points on the middle of point or page 8. There's a variety of reasons to make sure we're keeping our wetlands undeveloped, and really when you look at providing habitat, reduction in stormwater runoff and floodwater storage, the water filtration, protection of shorelines from erosion. They act as groundwater recharge areas, and they also act as groundwater discharge areas to help bring back lake levels and stream flows. And then also they do provide a recreational and educational opportunities for our citizens. So I really think just wanted to highlight some of the points there. At the bottom of page 8, I still have to fill in a threatened and endangered species section. In the last section I put this under water, but I guess I could probably move this out, is just looking at environmentally sensitive areas. And this is just kind of a generic catch-all that I like to put into plans just to look at certain issues. One thing that I did note in there is that the city has a wellhead protection overlay district in our zoning code. So basically anything within 1,200 feet, we have our discretion. Essentially, the code does not really give too much It's not very lengthy. Essentially what it means is if anything happens within that 1,200 feet, I'm calling Eric Anthon and asking, is this going to impact our municipal well? When you look at where our wells are, one is the old Water and Light. There's still a well at the old Water and Light building at the end of Water Street. Everything in that 1,200 feet is already developed, or it's wetland, or it's the river. So there's really, moving forward, there isn't going to be any new development. There isn't likely to be any sort of new development impacts on that. I mean, there could be a couple redevelopments here or there, but I can't imagine that's going to impact that wellhead. And the other one is out where Water and Light is currently on Maple Avenue. I've had one project come through so far where it would have been right on the edge. Well, actually, technically, that never did go through. But I had one project that almost went through that, and I contacted Eric, and he basically said it would really have to be a heavy industrial user for them to be concerned. So, but I did want to notify it just because I think it's obviously a critical resource, and we want to make sure that we do not do anything to our wellheads. And then the other thing I go through is potentially contaminated sites. If you look on the DNR website, the Bureau of Remediation and Redevelopment Tracking System, so it's basically an online database of known issues, and there's plenty of them. There, you could have spills, you could have a leaking underground storage tank, you could have a variety of other things that could be causing pollution. I know in a lot of cases these end up being manufacturing, old dry cleaning businesses, old gas stations are kind of the common ones that are identified. If you look at the database, we have 6 open sites in cleanup, or where cleanup is still underway. Looking at those, none of them were anything that I didn't see anything that was. I could list them if needed, but I just figured saying that there were 6 was probably adequate because most of them were, at the James Street project. There's a monitoring station still at basically where James and Manning intersect. One was one of the old gas stations in town. I'm trying to blank which one. And there was a few industrial type users that were identified on the list. But then also there's 103 that have been closed within the city. So just, yes.
How recent is that data?
How recent?
Your number that are open in the city.
Well, I
mean, is that
pulled it last.
2000 or 1900s, or is it 2017?
Well,
or?
One of the properties that was open was down on, basically it was almost on the corner of Water and James, and that's been open since like 2000 is when the DNR contacted the owner. So, I'm not sure if it's something that is, since it hasn't been closed yet. One, I don't think the property owner is probably taking the steps to close it, but 2, it's probably not a huge health concern based on what was in their file and what you can see in the database. So otherwise, more action would have been taken by now if there was other concerns that the DNR had.
Yeah,
so some of it is, I have a basic understanding of how their tracking system works, but just because it's open, it doesn't mean that it's that your neighbor's going to get sick from it.
Yeah, because like out here on Dick Street, where the new auto parts store is there, they kind of rushed that project through by taking the tanks all pumping, so on and so forth. That was done 5 years ago, probably, in that neighborhood. That's why I was wondering how recent your information was, because if you got something like that, it shouldn't be included anymore.
No, my information is as recent as DNR updates it, and I pulled it last week sometime.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
you have no control over that. I mean, it's just
Yeah. So I mean, it all depends on how often DNR goes and updates their files, and I have no idea of how often they do it. So, it's just good information to have. So, and then the last section under agricultural, natural, and cultural resources is cultural resources. And I have an outline here, and this is the one where I started doing this on my own, and then I realized it's going to be easier to get Carolyn Fredericks involved and just say, hey, what do you have on this? So I had a conversation with her last week, and I'm going to be having other conversations with her to kind of get some of this information pulled together. But this is kind of where we're at, talking about the historic districts, and then going through and talking about historical markers. We do have a couple museums here in town. Talking about civic organizations that help, so the landmarks, talking about HLPC a little bit. And I did have local history in the first chapter, but I think I'm also going to add a little section here about our local history. So then moving on, the next section would be talking, I just left a placeholder in there for goals, objectives, and policies. As we have our public outreach session and we have issues identified, once we get those issues identified by the community, that will lead directly into goals, objectives, and policies. But I did put in there as a placeholder because I thought it made sense to start talking about policies that came out of the urban transition areas from the county farmland preservation plan, talking about policies that were put in place or recommendations that were put in place from the Second Ward Creek and the Fireman's Park report, whether or not the city should consider opening some of those culverts and how best to do it. And then I did start compiling some sources that I use for this section. So, is there any questions? Is there anything do you think I missed?
Yeah, the cultural resources, I think you have a pretty good list going here, but the F&M Bank, that is recognized by the Department of the Interior, I think.
Yeah, that would go under the AHI, Architecture and History Inventory.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk about the districts, and I'm going to talk about some of the bigger ones. So yes, that's a good, Okay. I'll make sure I have that on there.
I remember when we went through the James Street project, that building was, you can't look at this, you can't put a tree in front of it. It was different than even City Hall or the library.
Okay.
Due to its recognition, so that's probably.
No,
and also the City Hall and library are nationally recognized too. Before that, though, under the contaminated sites, you said there's 6 open sites, and then when you talked about the site that we were dealing with for the James Street project, I think there's some information that came back in the last 6-8 months as a follow-up for that, and
I remember it came up at DT. So as soon as I saw it on the list, I knew exactly what it was. But that was out of my realm. I think Davis was dealing with it.
You may want to check
in the
in on it,
past.
because I think it was one of those things where there was no action required, but there may have been the option within a certain time.
I thought there was still monitoring going on, though.
There was, but I don't remember how it ended. But you may want to check in on that.
Okay, well, it might go back to Bob's question. I mean,
Yep.
they could be months behind on updating it. So
Could be.
but it is a good source of just kind of knowing what skeletons could potentially be buried on some of these sites.
Yeah.
And so.
And one more thing, let's see, I think it's page 6. Under impaired waters, you talk about the Federal Clean Water Act. Is that what kind of sparked our whole phosphorus issue with the wastewater treatment plant? Is those standards I mean, we do have the.
Well, I mean,
we have to take action because we have a wastewater treatment facility, so we have a responsibility because we have that here. But I thought when we went through that information, there was actually 2 different levels, I guess. So we have an endangered, or not the word endangered, impaired water Mill Pond and Crawfish River, but I believe there's a second layer that goes to that because this is a tributary that goes into the Rock River as well. So I know when Dave Arnott's been in to talk to us, I mean, there's just a ton of information, and there's been a lot of planning that's gone
Yeah.
into where we are now, but this seems like it's going to be an ongoing effort for many years.
Yeah, as I remember from those meetings, because I was not really directly involved with that, but I was at the meeting, so I kind of heard what was going on, and I remember Jason saying that basically what's going out is fine, and when you look at the map that DNR has, basically south of the dam, that stretch is not identified as impaired, but basically north of the dam is. And I remember him saying that what's coming in is what needs to be treated, or what needs to be addressed, because the TMDL is too high for phosphorus. So what they were going to do is take the credits that were unused from our wastewater facility, sell them, and then use those credits and use that money to help upstream, to help address the issue. So that's what I remember him saying.
Yeah. I do know that we've had a lot of discussion about different ways of decreasing the output of the wastewater treatment plant to come into compliance as well, which would be south of that, which is feeding into the Rock River. I just don't know if if there's another chapter of the comprehensive plan where you outline that plan, because there's been significant effort put in by the city to address that issue, both upstream, how we work with our partners upstream, and what we're facing at the wastewater
I
facility.
can follow up with Jason, and if they have more detail, I can
Dave
include it.
Arnott can probably give you
Okay,
about
I'll-
that much information.
Okay.
But we've been talking about it, I mean, since I've been here for the last 6 years, and I'm sure it's going to continue for the next 10 years, it sounds like.
Well, it just became impaired in 2014. So it's not like that section of the Crawfish has been identified as, and I remember Jason saying it's not like it's a blatant, it's just over the minimum. So it's not as bad as, I guess, other water bodies. So,
But I think that there's a lot of, I guess the action plan at this time is that, from my understanding and my memory, is that we're able to manage the output at the wastewater treatment plant with the plan of using chemicals, et cetera, and we can control that. But there was also discussion years ago of having to invest several $1 million to deal with the issue. So I think kind of outlining the path that we've taken through the recommendations and having that in here, I think, is important.
No, I agree. Well, and as I said, once I saw, yeah, no, you're right.
Not that I want you to do more writing, but to me, that's more specific to Columbus and,
No,
and our utility. Yep.
As I said, yeah. No, no, that makes sense. Well,
I don't know if that's lead laterals wouldn't be related to.
lead lateral, not, there is a utilities and community facilities section, and in there I'll be talking about wastewater plant. I will be talking about,
And maybe
I will be talking
maybe
about
that's the
city,
more
sewer, and
appropriate place
water.
to reflect my concerns.
well, in
too.
some of the stuff that's kind of has some gray area, that especially like from the first chapter that I just wrote because I knew it was going to be in the plan somewhere. Some of it's still going to get moved around.
Sure.
I've already started to look at stuff for the housing, which is the next chapter. And I have housing permit data or building permit data for new construction for houses, but then I'm also looking at, well, how much land did those new houses take up? And that's going to be more in the land use then. But yeah, I could show the same data in two different chapters. I don't think it would hurt anything, but.
And then the last thing was the comment under Tree City USA. We did just establish a tree inventory last year through GIS, and that was achieved through a grant that we received.
I didn't know that.
But that's probably significant information. That's been a change, significant change.
Yeah.
So then we have a plan to deal with our ash tree population, et cetera.
So tree inventory, yeah.
Even to my neighbors will burn them up.
That's all I had noticed on the first view. Thank you.
Okay. And as I said, going back to the impaired waters thing, I'll probably put a policy talk under, probably under policy that the city should continue to explore was it the phosphorus trading, or is that how it was termed? The credit trading to basically help resolve any issues around here. I think it's a great policy, especially since it doesn't really cost the city anything because they're trading. But from the way Jason talked, it's like we have so much available credits to us that we would never be able to use them all. Why as well sell them and help address that issue around here? It makes complete sense to me. So,
Bob, go ahead.
Upriver from us, 90% of the problem is caused by runoff from farmland, or am I wrong?
that's from what.
That's
Yeah.
what I was understanding. Anyway.
When I was looking at the DNR, because all the impaired waters have like a little, it's a kind of basically a database on DNR's website, and it said that it was the high levels of phosphorus came from non-point source, which meant multiple sources, and it was agricultural runoff as the primary culprit, is what they identified. So,
Okay.
and that's what Dave is from Rupert Milky is taking the credits. When they're selling the credits, we're working with farmers that are upstream from us, or that's at least to my understanding what they're doing, to basically help them make improvements so they don't have as much, they don't have as large of an impact on the crawfish.
Installing buffer zones and
Yeah.
things like that. And is that, some of that work's done through like the county, is it county land management, or there's some other governmental body at the county level that works with,
is it the land conservation department? I
yeah.
think is the official title.
I think so.
And that's, yeah, and I know Dave's been. I'll follow up with Dave just to see what they're doing in that process, because that would be important to talk about.
Dave
here.
knows that world inside and out better
Yeah.
than, yeah.
So. Other than that, I had nothing else. Is there any other questions before we move on?
I got a couple comments. I'll try to make them quick. I think it would be helpful to cite dates that you look these things up. For instance, the Columbia County Farmland Preservation Plan. What's the date of the plan that you're referencing? Things like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and is this chapter intended simply to be a catalog?
That's essentially what it always ends up being.
And then the goals, policies, and objectives, will they be written right into this chapter?
Yes.
Okay.
And the other thing that I mentioned previously that I'm going to do is all the goals, objectives, and policies will also be compiled into the executive summary that will be given to every plan commissioner will get one, and every council member will get one, because they really don't need to look at a lot of the stuff that's in here is to meet the state statute requirements and have basically a catalog of all this stuff.
Yeah, to be honest, I feel like it could be enhanced, right? We talk about geography and topography, right? And we talk about Columbia County in general, and I realize that's just lifted out of somewhere else. But how does, what are the things that are specific to Columbus, so that when we're looking at this, we know what's specific to Columbus, and then can write a goal, objective, or policy based on that,
Okay.
right?
No, I don't disagree.
And I assume there's going to be maps,
Yeah.
right, in that show the waterways, show
Yep.
the wetlands, show the soil types, things like that, so that when, I guess I'm looking at this from sort of a tool perspective, right? If it's just a catalog and history, I can go to the library and look that up. But if this is a tool that we're going to be using to shape growth and asset management and whatever else you want to say, it's got to be fairly specific. The last note I had on here that's probably germane is when some of this gets written to comment specifically on Columbus, we should probably take into account the extraterritorial area. I had that written down, and then you even mentioned the quarry that's just outside city limits. I assume you mean down on Fox Road, right?
Well, it's right off of 89.
Yeah, right.
In Fox Road.
Right. So that's within the potential development area of the city, and that should be talked about. I mean, if it's a planning document that looks at growth and expansion, then if we say, well, we're not going to talk about something because it's not inside the city, well,
No, I will make that. Yeah, it's a good idea.
Good suggestions. I was looking at page 4. I think the Ossian soils in this association are not suitable for on-site sewage disposal and basement because of a high water table. I think that there's probably sections of the city. I'll bring up my street that was reconstructed this year. Essentially, there was no drainage there until they pulled everything out. But I think to Uriah's point is that if there are challenges that we're going to be facing in areas of the city like that, it's poor drainage, stormwater issues that are related to those types of soils, perhaps. But I like that approach.
That's something that I need to have a meeting with. I can't remember his name now. Rupert Milky's GIS person. I met him a couple times, and I'm totally drawn a blank. But I've talked with Jason about, since we're doing the comp plan, that it will probably, or I should say, we will need to have maps created for this planning effort. So. It will just need to coordinate with them on that.
Sounds good. Do you have anything else?
No. The
assuming-
one thing I would also, I just thought of that. I anticipate once we get to the point, that assuming that everything goes through with that zoning permit approval process, since I'm going to have the power to issue a lot of these without. Well, I'm sure I'll, without, really anybody else looking at them. The one thing I want to do is just every month I'll have a report out to the Plan Commission saying, this is what got approved and I don't know if it'll just be like, so right now we're in January and saying, oh, this is what got approved in December of 2018. Just some sort of report out.
Sure.
Just so it goes, and it could go from Plan Commission to Council too, as just a report of a listing of things that have gotten approved recently. I think that would make it so at least there's a little bit more transparency between what's happening with this. I'm seeing a lot of nodding, so I'm assuming that's a good idea. So
I think so. I'm assuming our next meeting is not going to be Thursday, January 20th.
Yeah, that's.
I'm hoping not.
No, I sent
can.
out when I sent out the packets, about 20 minutes later, Patrick just emailed me and said, hey, by the way, the next meeting's the wrong date. And I'm like, oh, so I sent out an agenda like 20 minutes after I sent out the original packet. It is February 21st of 2019 is our next meeting. It's a Thursday at 6:30, obviously, so. Any other questions?
Since we're kind of getting started in the whole community engagement aspect of like the roadmap 2050, I mean, I don't know if there's going to be any specific, engagement efforts where you feel like the Plan Commission or its members should try to be present, or if our involvement here is sufficient enough. But I think we're trying to get as many people as we can to come out and participate in those. It's going to be part of the public participation of this, but also for our future planning as well, so.
Well, I would say, I guess, two things to that. One, I guess I'd encourage everybody on this group that when we have those, March 12th is our first kind of open house type citizen engagement event. And then I think it was April 30th is the second one that we have planned. Obviously, I'd want this group to be involved. The other thing we could do is we're going to have a public hearing for the comp plan before we approve it per state law, but have some sort of, and maybe we don't do it on a Thursday night, but some sort of open house type of event for the comp plan. Mm-hmm. Those are the things I kind of had in my mind. But since we're really, the public participation plan that this group adopted, I think it was late last year, mm-hmm. And actually it might have been summer of last year. That's maybe I should revise that to reflect, because a lot of that has changed because we did, when that was adopted, the thought is that there are going to kind of be two independent plans. And they still are two independent plans, but we're doing one large community outreach effort instead of having the roadmap do one and then our comp plan do one and have them competing and people getting confused, like why are we doing these two different public outreach efforts? You just asked me the same question a month ago. Mm-hmm. So it kind of delayed things, and it did change what we put in that public participation plan. That being said, the public participation plan isn't like a binding document. It is just a document that states your intentions of how you're going to communicate with the public. I still think, by and large, everything that's in that public participation plan we will be, carrying out. I mean, we are going to make those meetings. We are going to have public meetings where people can come and give us their input. Mm-hmm. We are going to be going through a survey process. So a lot of the things that was identified in that plan are still going to be done. So I don't know if it's really worth it to amend that, but. Please, and then not only have yourselves involved, but please tell others to be involved. Please tell your, friends and family that live in town that this is their chance to speak and influence our future. So,
if you're a part of any group or civic organization or anything like that too, I think there's been a lot of discussion about trying to reach out to mm-hmm. those organizations as well to have a presentation or some public input.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll say that this effort is doing is we're going to the public more so than having the public come to us. I mean, in a lot of cases you do a comp plan and, hey, we're going to have a public meeting, public information meeting at City Hall. Come at 6:00 on a Wednesday night, and you get 5 people that show up and give you their input, but it doesn't really move the needle, and it doesn't really capture what our community wants. So I think going out to the public and then also having it in different formats, where you have surveys, where you have a couple open house or a couple open meetings, I think it's going to be productive. And the other thing is that rather than city staff being the only ones to lead it, the mayor is involved. We have citizens that are very actively involved, from business leaders, from the CEO of our hospital. So I think that is very powerful too, is that we have some people who are invested that I think will give lend some credibility to this effort. So I'm pretty excited about the next couple months. It might be busy, but that's life. So.
All right, thanks. Unless there's anything else, then I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We stand adjourned, and our next meeting then is scheduled for February 21st, 2019. Thanks.